Somewhere outside a sleepy town called Ashford Hollow, there's a mansion with a skull sign, 22 windows, and a raccoon that judges everyone who walks in. 6 people vanished there. A 7th was about to. I'm Detective Emma Carter. I solve missing pets, cheating spouses, and, apparently, occasionally, 150-year-old supernatural spreadsheet errors. This is the story of the most polite haunting in recorded history, featuring a ghost who's terrible at being scary, a landlord obsessed with clipboards, and a secret ingredient that changed everything. Grab a snack. Possibly lasagna. This is the house that counted, very badly. My name is Emma Carter, and I became a detective because I once watched a rerun of a crime show at 2 a.m. and thought, I could do that, minus the trench coat, because trench coats make me sweat. 6 years later, here I am, sitting in my office above a laundromat in the town of Ashford Hollow, listening to a woman named Sarah Mitchell cry into a tissue that has clearly been recycled from a previous cry. My brother went to Thornfield Manor, she said. 3 days ago. He hasn't come back. I nearly spilled my coffee. Not because of the missing brother, though obviously that's concerning, but because of the words Thornfield Manor. Everyone in Ashford Hollow knows that house the way everyone knows not to microwave a burrito without poking holes in it first. And yet, apparently, some people never learn. Why would he go there? I asked. It's condemned. There's a sign. The sign has a skull on it. Not even a subtle skull. A cartoon skull, grinning, wearing sunglasses, for some reason. He said he wanted to livestream it, Sarah said. For his channel. Thornfield Manor, is it really haunted? He has 400 subscribers. 400, I repeated. He risked his life for an audience smaller than my aunt's WhatsApp group, and my aunt's WhatsApp group mostly forwards conspiracy theories about ceiling fans. Here's what you need to know about Thornfield Manor, for context. The house sits on a hill outside town, all gray stone and crooked shutters, like something a Gothic novel sneezed out and then never cleaned up after. It belonged to the Thornfield family until 1994, when the last of them, a reclusive widow named Constance Thornfield, vanished without a trace, leaving behind an open door, a kettle boiling dry on the stove, and, according to one very specific rumor, 40 unopened bags of potpourri. Since then, the house has swallowed, in the town's dramatic phrasing, exactly 6 people. Sarah's brother Alex would make 7, which is a number I personally find unlucky mostly because it doesn't divide evenly into anything. Please, Sarah said. The police already looked. They found nothing. They said he probably ran off to avoid his student loans. That is a wildly specific and oddly plausible police theory. He wouldn't do that. He loves his channel too much. He was 2 videos away from monetization. I promised I'd take the case, partly because Sarah's eyes had that particular kind of desperate hope that makes you feel like garbage if you say no, and partly because I hadn't paid my rent in a way that could be called on time since March. I packed a flashlight, a granola bar, and my grandmother's pepper spray, which she insists still works despite being purchased during a presidential administration I can no longer name with confidence. As I locked my office, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Don't go to the house, detective. It's very particular about guests. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I did the only reasonable thing. I texted back, does it take reservations? I hate showing up places unannounced. Nobody replied, which I chose to interpret as a soft yes, and drove to the manor with the quiet confidence of a woman who has clearly not thought this through even slightly. Thornfield Manor did not look welcoming. It looked like a building that had personally wronged several architects and regretted nothing, and also possibly needed its gutters cleaned. I parked at the gate, since my car, a 14-year-old hatchback named Bertha, made it clear through a series of concerning noises that she was not driving up that gravel driveway. Thank you very much, and also could I please stop feeding her the cheap gas? Walking up, I counted the windows, because I count things when I'm nervous, a habit that has never once been useful and yet persists anyway. 22 windows on the front face. 4 of them had curtains, even though the house had supposedly been empty for 30 years, which felt, frankly, like showing off. The front door was ajar. I chose to interpret this as free entry, no need to pick the lock rather than flee immediately, because I am a professional, and also because I forgot how to pick locks after that one unfortunate incident with my neighbor's shed that we do not talk about. Inside, the air smelled like dust, old paper, and something that might have been potpourri, finally opened after 30 years and regretting every decision that led to that moment. Alex? I called. Ashford Hollow Investigations. I'm not a ghost. I'm worse. I bill hourly. No answer, except for the house settling, which is what old houses do when they want you to think they're breathing dramatically instead of just being poorly insulated. The foyer had a grand staircase and a portrait above the fireplace of a stern-faced woman in black lace, presumably Constance Thornfield. Her painted eyes had that trick where they seemed to follow you around the room, except in her case, I got the distinct impression she was actively judging my shoes. They're comfortable, I told the portrait. Try chasing suspects in heels. I dare you. You're a painting. You have no feet. This is not a fair fight. The portrait, being a portrait, declined to respond, which I considered a win for me. I searched the ground floor. A study, a dining room set for 12 with suspiciously dust-free plates, which struck me as either very sinister or evidence of an extremely dedicated Roomba, and a parlor with a grandfather clock stopped at 3:17, presumably because nobody had wound it since the Clinton administration. On the study wall, scratched into the wood paneling in red marker, I checked, definitely marker, someone had left the cap on the floor nearby like an absolute animal, was a tally. Slash marks in groups of 5, over 100 of them. I counted them out of habit. 142. That's a lot of something, I muttered. Grocery list, maybe. Extremely specific grocery list. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. I spun around, pepper spray raised like a tiny, expired sword, and found a raccoon. A very large, very unbothered raccoon, sitting in the doorway, staring at me with the weary judgment of a creature that has seen many detectives come through this house and found all of them equally overdramatic. Oh, I said. Okay. Hi. Sorry. The raccoon sighed, an actual, audible sigh, which felt deeply unfair, and waddled off down a hallway I hadn't noticed before. I followed it, because at this point, taking directions from local wildlife seemed like as good a strategy as any. The corridor ended at a staircase leading down. Basement stairs, in a house with a raccoon tour guide. Sure. Fine. Nothing about this feels remotely unusual. I went down anyway. At the bottom, my flashlight caught a framed photograph on the wall, remarkably dust-free, of 6 people standing in front of the manor, all smiling the specific smile of people who have just been told to smile. I recognized one immediately from the missing person flyer Sarah had shown me. Alex. But the photograph looked at least 20 years old. Which meant either Alex had a time-traveling twin, or something considerably weirder was going on, and I was going to need a much bigger flashlight, and possibly a snack, because I was starting to get genuinely hangry. Behind me, the basement door swung shut with a definitive thunk, and the lights that should absolutely not have worked in a house with no power for 30 years, flickered on, revealing a room covered floor to ceiling in tally marks, and, beneath them, carved in foot-tall letters, 7 more and the house is full. Underneath that, in noticeably fresher, smaller handwriting, someone had added, "Please take a number. Thank you for your patience." I stared at the second line for a very long time. This, I said, to nobody in particular, is either the most terrifying thing I've ever seen, or the most passive-aggressive customer service experience of my life, and I genuinely cannot decide which. Beneath the "take a number" line, in yet a third handwriting, someone had added a small, hand-drawn arrow pointing to a literal ticket dispenser bolted to the wall, the kind you'd find at a deli counter, complete with a curling red now-serving number that currently read, with devastating specificity, 148. I stared at the ticket dispenser for a long moment, the way you'd stare at a parking meter that had somehow developed opinions about your life choices. "Okay," I said, "if this house has a ticket system, I want to speak to whoever's in charge of scheduling, because that is genuinely useful information and also deeply unsettling that it exists at all." Somewhere above me, a floorboard creaked in what I can only describe as an offended manner, and a stack of very old paperwork on a nearby table rustled itself into a slightly neater pile, entirely unprompted, the way a nervous administrative assistant reorganizes things when their boss walks by unannounced. I picked up one of the loose papers, mostly out of morbid curiosity, and found it was, unmistakably, an actual form, a form with checkboxes, several of which had been filled out in blue ink, in a looping, anxious cursive, under a header that read, in faded but legible print, "Thornfield Manor intake form, please select your preferred haunting experience." The options included, in order, classic moaning, abject levitation, mild, cold spot, ankle height only, and distant organ music, volume adjustable. Someone had checked cold spot and distant organ music, and left a small note in the margin, "Nothing too dramatic, I have a heart condition, had, technically, but old habits." "There is an intake form," I said, to the empty room, feeling the specific, dizzying vertigo of a woman whose entire understanding of horror movies had just been quietly, thoroughly dismantled by paperwork. "There is an ankle-height cold spot option." I genuinely don't know what to do with this information. Let it be known that I did not scream. I made a sound. A dignified, detective-appropriate sound, somewhere between a gasp and the noise Bertha's engine makes when it's cold outside and personally offended about it. The door was locked, obviously, because the universe has a sense of humor and it is, frustratingly, a slapstick one today. I searched the basement, which stretched further than I expected, all support beams and cobwebs, until I found a row of small alcoves along one wall, each holding a single object, a wristwatch, a red shoe, a wedding ring, and a modern vlogging camera. I picked it up, checked the memory card slot. Empty, except for a single sticky note taped inside, which read, in handwriting far too cheerful for the situation, "Sorry. Borrowed your battery." The house apologized to me, I said aloud. The literal building said sorry. This is objectively the politest kidnapping I have ever heard of. I found a second door, unlocked, leading through a servant's passage into what had once been a wine cellar, now empty except for a single wooden chair with a coat draped over it, arranged with suspicious neatness, like a scarecrow assembled by someone with a very specific eye for interior design. "Alex?" The chair was empty, obviously, because that would be far too easy. In the coat pocket, I found Alex's phone, cracked screen, one notification glowing, livestream ended 3 days ago. 1,204 viewers were watching when the connection was lost. 1,200 people watched a man vanish live on the internet and not one of them called anyone. I made a mental note to be extremely disappointed in the internet later, on a schedule, possibly with snacks. I pressed play. Alex's face filled the screen, grinning his nervous vlogger grin. Okay guys, so I'm in the basement, this is insane, I think I found, wait, do you guys hear that? Is that counting? A voice picked up on the recording, rhythmic, climbing, 139. 140. 141. Who's counting? Hello? Can you not do that? Actually, it's very stressful. The video cut to static, and underneath the static, faint but unmistakable, the counting continued, 142. The exact number from the study wall. The phone screen flickered, and then, in text, a message appeared that had absolutely no business appearing on a cracked screen phone belonging to a possibly vanished vlogger. Is this thing on? Sorry, I'm new to haunting. Give me a second. I stared at it. You're new to this? I said, to the empty cellar. How new? Because you've had 142 tally marks worth of practice, which feels like it should be enough for at least an intermediate certification. The lights flickered off, then on, then off again, in a rhythm that felt less ancient evil and more someone learning to use a light switch app for the first time. Somewhere deeper in the cellar, I heard the unmistakable sound of a kettle beginning to whistle, followed by a muffled voice calling, Rachel, dear, is that a guest? Should I put out the good biscuits or the everyday biscuits? The everyday biscuits, Marjorie, we don't know her yet, came a second voice, slightly panicked, from what sounded like an entirely different room that should not have existed in a basement this size. A voice, close behind me, said, apologetically, 143. Sorry. I'm still getting the hang of the counting. It's supposed to be scary but I keep losing my place. I turned around very, very slowly. Standing behind me was, unmistakably, a ghost, translucent, faintly glowing, dressed in an outfit that could most charitably be described as 1990s substitute teacher, wringing her hands with the palpable anxiety of someone about to bomb a job interview. Hi, she said. I'm so sorry to frighten you. I'm told I'm supposed to be more menacing about this, but honestly, I've never been very good at menacing. I once tried to scare a raccoon and it just stared at me until I apologized. I would like to formally state, for the record, that I did not faint. I sat down very suddenly on a nearby crate, which is different, and also entirely reasonable given the circumstances. You're a ghost, I said. Technically, yes. Though I prefer house employee. Ghost has connotations. She adjusted a pair of glasses that, given her transparency, served absolutely no visible purpose. I'm Rachel. Rachel Carter. I used to be a governess here, back in the 90s, before, well. She gestured vaguely at her own see-through torso. This happened. Carter, I repeated. That's my last name. Rachel's translucent eyebrows shot up. Oh. Oh, goodness. Well, that does simplify some paperwork, actually. I've been meaning to update my files. I'm sorry, what paperwork? The house keeps records. Very meticulous ones. Constance, she's the previous owner, lovely woman, terrifying filing system, set up this whole thing where the house needs to reach a certain number before it can, well, retire, I suppose is the word. Stop bothering people. It's all rather bureaucratic, honestly, which nobody tells you about hauntings. You'd think it would be more dramatic candles and less quarterly reporting. You're telling me this house runs on a spreadsheet? A ledger, technically, but yes, functionally, a spreadsheet with extremely poor customer service. Rachel floated over to the wall of tally marks and gestured at them with visible embarrassment. I've been trying to slow the counting down for years. I really don't want to hurt anyone. But the house gets very insistent, and it's dreadfully hard to argue with a building. They simply don't listen, structurally speaking. Behind her, a second figure phased through the wall, Alex, looking mildly annoyed and entirely unharmed, holding what appeared to be a mug of tea. "Oh, hi," Alex said, waving. "You must be the detective. Sorry about all this, it's actually been pretty chill." Rachel's been really nice. We've mostly just been doing crosswords. You've been doing crosswords? The 7-letter one stumped us for 2 days. Turns out it was haunted. Rachel thought that was very funny. I didn't, at the time, but it's grown on me. I put my head in my hands. So nobody here is actually trying to hurt anyone. Goodness, no, Rachel said, looking genuinely offended at the suggestion. I just need the house's ledger to reach its number so everyone can finally go home, myself included, and I've been much too soft-hearted to actually take anyone properly. So we've all just sort of been hanging out down here. It's actually been lovely. Alex taught me what a podcast is. There's a whole true crime one about disappearances at this exact house, Alex added helpfully. It's actually pretty inaccurate. They get the number of windows wrong. 22, I said automatically. It's 22 windows. See? Alex said, pointing at me. See, Rachel, I told you people would notice. Rachel wrung her transparent hands again. The trouble is, the house doesn't know I've been stalling. And it's getting rather cross about it. It's due to close its books tonight, on the anniversary of the original agreement, and if the number doesn't add up properly, it might do something drastic on its own, without my permission, which would be dreadfully inconvenient for everyone, especially the 6 of you it's currently housing. 6? Oh, didn't I mention? Everyone's here. All 6 previous disappearances. We've got quite the little book club going, actually. Marjorie makes an excellent lasagna, considering she's been dead since 1994 and has no working kitchen. How does she? Best not to ask. Some mysteries even I haven't solved. I stood up, dusted off my extremely comfortable and correctly chosen shoes, and looked Rachel dead in her translucent eyes. Okay, I said. New plan. We're going to fix this ledger situation, get everyone out of this house, and get you an actual retirement, because frankly, you've earned it after 30 years of underground crosswords and lasagna diplomacy. But first, I held up a finger. I need someone to explain to me, slowly, why a house has a filing system. Rachel brightened considerably. Oh, that's actually a wonderful story. Constance's grandfather was, historically speaking, an absolute menace of a businessman. Somewhere above us, the entire house shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling, and a low, groaning voice, deeper, older, considerably less apologetic than Rachel's, echoed through the walls. Rachel. Who let a detective in? We talked about this. Rachel winced. That would be Constance. She's normally lovely, very committed to her hospitality standards, but she does get a bit testy around deadline season. The lights went out entirely, and in the sudden dark, Rachel's voice came through, small and apologetic as ever. This might get a little dramatic for the next part, I'm afraid. She really does insist on a proper haunted house atmosphere before negotiations. It's very important to her. I do apologize in advance for anything that happens in approximately the next 30 seconds. What happened in the next 30 seconds was, in fairness, dramatic. The chandelier above us swung wildly though there was no wind, all 6 alcove objects rattled in unison, and a voice like a slamming door announced, with the theatrical timing of someone who had clearly rehearsed this in the mirror for 32 years, "Who dares?" Then the lights flicked back on to reveal Constance Thornfield standing at the top of the cellar stairs in full black lace, dramatically backlit, holding, and I want to be very clear this undercut the moment considerably, a clipboard. "Oh good, you're here," Constance said, dropping the booming voice entirely and switching to a brisk, businesslike tone. "Rachel, did you file the March paperwork?" "I cannot close the books without the March paperwork, we have discussed this at length." "It's in the good folder," Rachel said. "The one with the ghost stickers." "The ghost stickers are for the fun folder, Rachel, we've been over this." "Excuse me," I said, raising a hand like I was back in 8th grade. "Sorry to interrupt the world's spookiest performance review, but there's an actual living human being standing in your basement, and I'd love to know if I'm about to become a permanent line item." Constance turned to me, and up close, without the booming voice and dramatic lighting, she looked less like a supernatural landlord and more like a mildly stressed office manager who hadn't taken a vacation in 150 years, which, generously, she hadn't. "You're the detective," she said. "Emma Carter." "Yes, we're aware. We do background checks." "It's a whole thing." "You do background checks on the people you're haunting?" "We're not monsters," Constance said, sounding genuinely wounded. "Well, I mean, historically, my great-great-grandfather Ezra rather was one, financially speaking, but the rest of us have tried very hard to run a tight, ethical ship since then." "Which is precisely the problem." She sighed, an old, tired sound, and sat down heavily on an overturned crate, clipboard still in hand. "Ezra made a deal, a century and a half ago, to keep the family fortune afloat. The terms were, and I want to stress this was entirely his doing, none of the rest of us signed off on it, 150 years of prosperity in exchange for 150 souls, tallied up however the house saw fit. That's an absolutely deranged business model." "I agree," Constance said, with sudden and startling passion. "I have been saying this for 30 years. Do you know how hard it is to ethically source 150 souls while also not wanting to actually hurt anybody? I've spent 3 decades doing everything in my power to slow this thing down. Rachel and I have literally been running a haunted mansion like it's a very depressing summer camp just to avoid actually finishing the count." "The lasagna," I said slowly. "The crosswords." "The lasagna," Constance confirmed. "Marjorie's a delight. She used to run the local bakery before, well, all this. We've got a whole little community down here. Frankly, it's the most functional workplace I've ever managed, and I say that as someone who's been managing a literal haunted house for 3 decades. Alex, still holding his tea, chimed in helpfully. "Constance also runs a book club. We just finished a mystery novel." She guessed the killer immediately, it was very annoying. "I've had 150 years to develop pattern recognition, Alex, forgive me for being good at my one hobby." I looked between the ghost of an anxious governess, the ghost of an extremely competent and mildly exhausted middle manager, and a very relaxed vlogger drinking tea in a basement that was apparently doubling as a book club venue, and felt the specific, disorienting sensation of a situation being simultaneously the strangest and most reasonable thing I had ever encountered. "Okay," I said. "So if you both hate this arrangement, and nobody actually wants to hurt anyone, why hasn't anybody just broken the deal?" Constance and Rachel exchanged a look, the specific look of 2 co-workers who have had the same argument approximately 400 times. Because, Constance said, breaking Ezra's original bargain requires a descendant of his bloodline to formally renounce it, in his own handwriting, on the ledger's final page, on the anniversary of the original signing. Which is tonight, as it happens. And the only surviving Thornfield descendant anyone's been able to track down, is me, Rachel finished, looking suddenly very small and very translucent. Constance found out 3 years after I started working here. It's rather the whole reason I ended up staying on permanently, if I'm honest. Ezra had a daughter out of wedlock, generations back, whose line eventually became, well, the Carters. I stared at her. You're a Thornfield. Distantly. Very distantly. I found out approximately 2 decades too late to do anything useful with the information, unfortunately, on account of being deceased. But I'm a Carter too, I said slowly, the pieces clicking together with the specific dread of someone realizing a filing error is about to become their entire personality. Which means, Constance said, standing up and dusting off her dress with brisk, businesslike efficiency, that you, Emma Carter, are, as far as our extremely thorough background check could determine, the only living descendant capable of signing this ledger closed tonight. Which is either wonderful news or a tremendous headache, depending entirely on how you feel about mild bureaucracy and moderate blood-based paperwork. Blood-based, I repeated. There's a blood part. Just a little, Rachel said apologetically. A drop, really. We're not savages. There's a very nice hand sanitizer station right after. There's paperwork after the blood, too, I should mention, Constance added, flipping to a laminated checklist clipped to the inside of her clipboard. Standard exit interview. Nothing invasive. Mostly rate your overall haunting experience, 1 to 5 stars. Would you recommend Thornfield Manor to a friend, that sort of thing? We take feedback very seriously. You want me to fill out a satisfaction survey, I said, about the haunted house that trapped 6 people for 30 years. Constructive feedback, ideally, Constance said. Though I'll admit Marjorie's lasagna reviews have been overwhelmingly positive, which has been a real bright spot in an otherwise fairly grim 32 years of quarterly reports. There have been quarterly reports. House doesn't run itself, dear. Ezra set up quite the bureaucracy before he vanished off to wherever unrepentant Victorian businessmen go. I've had to manage a full accounting ledger, staff morale, and let me tell you, keeping 6 mildly cursed guests entertained for 3 decades without proper Wi-Fi is a full-time job in itself, and, as of 18 months ago, an entire pest control situation involving a raccoon who unionized. The raccoon unionized. He calls himself a shop steward. He has demands. Mostly involving the dining room's leftover cheese course. I found it easier to simply comply. Constance sighed the specific sigh of a middle manager who has, over the course of a supernatural tenure, been slowly ground down by logistics rather than any actual evil intent. Frankly, Ms. Carter, between the raccoon's collective bargaining and Ezra's frankly baffling original filing system, did you know he organized the ledger by astrological sign instead of, say, chronologically, like a reasonable person? I have been counting down the days until someone finally walked in here and ended this whole enterprise. You have no idea what a relief this is. I might actually take a vacation. I haven't had a proper vacation since 1889. Where would a ghost even go on vacation? I hear the coast is lovely this time of year, Constance said, with the wistful, faraway look of a woman who had genuinely thought about this far more than the situation warranted. Assuming I can still leave the property boundaries once the ledger's closed. That's actually one of the open questions on tonight's agenda, if you don't mind. We do have rather a lot to get through before midnight. I called my grandmother from the wine cellar, because apparently that was a thing I could do now. Rachel confirmed the house had surprisingly good cell service, one of the only upsides of the whole cursed bargain situation. Grandma, I said, quick question. Did we have a distant cousin named Rachel Carter who used to work at Thornfield Manor? There was a very long pause. Emma, my grandmother said slowly, are you sitting down? I'm sitting on a crate in a haunted wine cellar next to a ghost who does crosswords and a vlogger who's apparently made friends with his own kidnappers book club. I was going to ease into this, my grandmother admitted, but that does rather sound like you've already found out the important parts. 40 minutes, one very long phone call, and one entire box of tissues later, mine, not the ghost's, since Rachel's tears, I learned, evaporate before they hit the ground, which is convenient, honestly, saves on laundry. I understood the whole ridiculous, oddly sweet story. Rachel Carter, my grandmother's cousin, had come to work at Thornfield Manor in 1991, discovered the family's absurd supernatural bargain a few years in, and rather than run screaming, which, frankly, I respected, had spent decades quietly trying to fix it from the inside, one crossword and lasagna dinner at a time, while raising my mother in secret with my grandmother's help before finally, permanently, becoming part of the house's very strange, very gentle staff. She always said she'd find a way to fix it properly, my grandmother said, voice thick. She just never had a descendant close enough, or brave enough, or foolish enough, depending how you want to phrase it, to actually walk in and finish the job. I contain multitudes, I said. Foolish is definitely one of them. Back in the cellar, Rachel had set out the actual ledger, the infamous leather-bound book, considerably less menacing now that I knew its main function was, essentially, extremely overdue HR paperwork, open to its final page, Ezra Thornfield's ancient signature sprawled across the bottom of a very poorly worded, morally horrifying contract. All you need to do, Constance explained, tapping the page with her clipboard like the world's most efficient office manager, is write the truth beneath his signature, namely, that the fortune this family built was based on theft, not sacrifice, and that the debt was never anyone's to collect in the first place, and then sign your own name over his in a small amount of blood. Very small. A paper cut's worth, really. We're professionals. And that fixes everything? No more haunting? No more counting? Everyone gets to leave? Everyone gets to leave, Rachel confirmed, eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like hope after 32 years of careful, exhausted patience. Including me, I should think. Though I admit I'll rather miss the crosswords. We can mail you the newspaper, Alex offered. Wherever you end up. Do ghosts get mail? We're about to find out, Constance said dryly, which is, historically, my favorite kind of experiment. I picked up the ancient quill pen sitting beside the ledger, because of course there was an ancient quill pen. This house had never once done anything the easy way, and wrote, beneath Ezra Thornfield's signature, in my own handwriting, this family's fortune was built on theft, not sacrifice. The debt was never real. It ends here. Then, with a small kitchen paring knife Marjorie the ghost baker had insisted on lending me, much more sanitary than that rusty old thing they usually use, honestly, the health code violations in this house, I pressed my thumb, drew the smallest possible drop of blood, and pressed it beneath my signature. For one long, suspended moment, absolutely nothing happened, and I had just enough time to think, well, that's mildly anticlimactic, before the entire house let out a sound like a very large, very old person finally, gratefully exhaling after holding their breath for 150 years. Before we get to the ledger signing, the ghostly exodus, and the frankly touching goodbye speech, I need to talk about Marjorie, Because Marjorie deserves her own chapter and I will not be talked out of this. Marjorie Higgins had run Ashford Hollow's only bakery from 1988 until her disappearance in 1994, a fact I learned entirely because she insisted on telling me her full professional history while ladling a truly enormous portion of lasagna onto a paper plate that had, somehow, not existed in this basement 30 seconds earlier. The trick, Marjorie explained, with the intensity of a woman who has had 32 years and 0 live audiences to practice this speech, is you brown the meat twice. Once for flavor, once out of spite. People don't understand the spite step. It's crucial. I feel like I should be writing this down. You should be, Marjorie said. I've been dying, no pun intended, well, slight pun intended, to pass this recipe on to a living person for 3 decades. Do you know what it's like, developing the perfect lasagna technique with no one to feed it to except 5 other ghosts and one extremely judgmental raccoon? The raccoon eats lasagna? The raccoon has opinions about lasagna, which is worse. He docked me half a star once over the ricotta-to-noodle ratio. A raccoon. Reviewing my cooking. I've made peace with it, mostly, but I want that on the record as one of the more humbling experiences of my afterlife. Beside her, a man I hadn't been introduced to yet, tall, mustached, wearing what appeared to be a cardigan from at least 3 decades before he'd vanished, extended a translucent hand for me to, unsuccessfully, shake. Harold, he said. Local mailman, 1994 vintage. I want you to know I've read every single crossword puzzle book in this house at least 4 times, and I would like it formally noted that Rachel cheats. I do not cheat, Rachel said, from across the cellar, sounding genuinely wounded. I simply have a very strong vocabulary. You looked up petrichor on Alex's phone, Rachel, I watched you do it, don't lie to the nice detective, that was one time, Harold. And it was for a very difficult Saturday puzzle. Those are allowed to be hard, that's the point of Saturday. I sat down on an overturned crate, accepted a plate of genuinely excellent lasagna from a ghost who took her cooking more seriously than most living chefs I'd met, and listened to 2 spirits argue about crossword puzzle ethics while a third, a soft spoken older woman named Doris who'd apparently run the town's flower shop before Rachel's descendant took it over generations later, quietly knitted what appeared to be a scarf using yarn that, as far as I could tell, was not physically present in the room. How do you knit with no yarn? I asked. Very carefully, Doris said, not looking up. It's mostly about commitment to the bit, dear. It occurred to me, somewhere around my second helping of lasagna, that I had walked into this house fully expecting screaming, chains, possibly a demonic entity or 2, and had instead stumbled into what could only be described as the world's most literal ghost town, a tiny, cheerful, extremely opinionated community of people who had spent 3 decades being kidnapped by a cursed real estate ledger and had responded to this injustice not with rage or despair, but by starting a book club and perfecting a lasagna recipe. You know, I said, to the cellar at large, for a haunted house, this is genuinely one of the more pleasant afternoons I've had all month. That's the spirit, Marjorie said, beaming, entirely unbothered by her own pun this time. Now eat your lasagna before Constance finishes her paperwork. Once the negotiating starts, it gets very tense and nobody remembers to offer seconds. The tally marks on every wall of Thornfield Manor faded at once, like chalk in the rain, and with them, the strange, oppressive weight the house had carried the whole time I'd been inside it, the sense of being watched, counted, catalogued, simply lifted, all at once, leaving behind nothing but an old, drafty, structurally questionable building that badly needed new gutters. 6 figures shimmered into visibility around the cellar, the previous disappearances, all of them looking remarkably relaxed for people who'd been dead or missing for decades, one of them, presumably Marjorie, holding an actual lasagna dish with genuine, non-ghostly steam rising off it. "Oh, thank goodness," Marjorie said, setting the lasagna down. "I've been dying to try this on someone with a working digestive system." "No pun intended." "Big pun intended," Alex said. "Enormous pun." Constance checked her clipboard one final time, made a small, satisfied checkmark, and looked up with an expression I hadn't seen on her the entire strange evening, genuine, uncomplicated relief. "Well," she said. "That's the books closed. Rachel, dear, would you like to do the honors?" Rachel floated forward, translucent and glowing softly, and looked at me with an expression that made my throat go tight despite 30 minutes ago having been actively frightened of her existence. "Thank you," she said simply. "For finishing what I started. I know it's terribly strange to say to someone you've known for approximately 2 hours, but I am enormously proud of you, and I've had 32 years to think about how I'd want to say that, if I ever got the chance. You could have led with 'I'm your long-lost ghost relative' instead of 'sorry to frighten you,'" I said, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "Would have saved us both some time." "I really am dreadful at the scary parts," Rachel admitted, smiling. "Always have been. Light, warm, ordinary, entirely unspooky light, the kind that comes from an actual sunrise rather than anything supernatural, began pouring through the cellar's small, high windows, and one by one, the ghostly former residents of Thornfield Manor began to fade, gently, unhurriedly, like guests finally heading home after a very long, very unusual dinner party. "Tell my grandmother I love her," Rachel said, already going translucent at the edges. "And tell your mother I'm sorry I never got to make her lasagna myself. Marjorie's is good, but mine has a secret ingredient." "What's the secret ingredient?" "Nutmeg," Rachel said, entirely deadpan, as she dissolved into the morning light. "It's just nutmeg. I built up 30 years of mystique for a spice rack staple. Please don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain, even posthumously." And then she was gone, not with a dramatic flash or a mournful wail, but the way a very tired person finally, happily falls asleep, and the wine cellar of Thornfield Manor, for the first time in 150 years, was simply, unremarkably empty. Here is the deeply unglamorous truth about resolving a haunted house situation. The aftermath involves an extraordinary amount of paperwork, none of which, disappointingly, is haunted. 6 formerly missing persons walked out of Thornfield Manor that morning looking suspiciously well-rested and, in Marjorie's case, insisting on handing out lasagna recipe cards to bewildered county officials. Alex's reunion with Sarah involved 20 minutes of crying followed immediately by Alex asking whether his channel had grown while he was away, a question Sarah answered by hitting him with a couch cushion, which I considered an entirely appropriate detective consultation fee. The county inspector who came to formally assess the property found the whole thing charmingly boring, structural settling, some water damage, nothing supernatural. Why do people always ask that? Which I did not correct, mostly because actually, sir, it was a haunted spreadsheet felt like a conversation that would end my career rather than advance it. My grandmother cried when I told her the whole story, then immediately demanded Rachel's nutmeg lasagna secret be added to the family recipe book, properly credited this time, which felt like exactly the right way to honor someone who'd spent 3 decades running the world's gentlest haunted house. Gerald, the retired librarian/pigeon enthusiast who'd started this whole mess with a mysterious brass key, admitted over tea a week later that he'd been quietly in love with Rachel decades ago, before all this happened, and had spent 30 years hoping someone would eventually walk in and fix things. "She'd have found this whole thing very funny," he said, watching pigeons squabble over a dropped muffin. The lasagna diplomacy. The crossword book club. Very her. She seemed like she would have been a genuinely wonderful person to know. She was, Gerald agreed. Terrible at being scary, though. Absolutely dreadful at it. I always told her so. As for Thornfield Manor itself, nobody burned it down, nobody bulldozed it dramatically. The town council, after extensive debate, voted to turn it into a bed and breakfast, which felt, given everything I now knew about the house's actual disposition, weirdly appropriate. It reopened 6 months later under the name The Nutmeg Inn, and I am reliably informed the lasagna on the dinner menu is, and I quote several online reviews, inexplicably, suspiciously good, 5 stars, would recommend, ask for the secret ingredient, the owner just winks and won't say. Sarah paid my invoice in full, plus a bonus, since solved a 150-year-old accidentally sweet supernatural bureaucracy situation wasn't exactly a standard line item on my rate card. I used part of it to fix Bertha's engine, and the rest on a new kettle for my grandmother, who insisted the old one had, in her words, started acting a little funny lately, which I chose, very deliberately, not to investigate further. Late that night, back in my office above the laundromat, I found an envelope slipped under my door, no return address, my name written in handwriting I now recognized, warm, looping, faintly translucent in a way that shouldn't have been physically possible for actual ink but absolutely was. Inside was a single recipe card. Lasagna. Secret ingredient, nutmeg. Second secret ingredient, don't tell Marjorie I told you, she's very competitive about this. Go be happy, Emma. You've more than earned it. R.C. I pinned it above my desk, made myself a cup of tea in a mug that had definitely, probably, almost certainly stopped being haunted, and put my feet up. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I stared at it for a long moment, heart doing an unhelpful little lurch, before remembering, correctly, this time, that not every unknown number in my life was secretly a very apologetic haunted mansion with a filing system. I answered. Ashford Hollow Investigations. Emma speaking. Before you ask, no, I don't do haunted houses anymore. I've filled my quota for the decade, possibly the century. It's not haunted, said a hesitant voice. It's my cat. He's been missing for 2 days. My neighbor swears she saw him get into a very fancy car with a man who looked, and I quote, suspiciously like a cat burglar, ironically. I glanced at the recipe card pinned above my desk, at Bertha's keys on the counter, at the muffin wrapper I still hadn't thrown away, a small, strange souvenir of the strangest and most surprisingly wholesome week of my life. You know what, I said, smiling, that sounds exactly like my kind of case. Tell me everything. And for the record, if this cat turns out to be a ghost too, I am charging double. Outside my window, Ashford Hollow settled into an ordinary evening, and somewhere across town, a very old house, freshly renovated, smelling faintly of nutmeg, its ledger finally, cheerfully closed, welcomed its first paying guests for the night, no counting required. I want to tell you what happened at the Nutmeg Inn's grand opening, 6 months later, because I was there, and because I think it says something nice about how these things can turn out, if you're lucky, and if the haunted house in question happens to have excellent workplace values. Gerald cut the ribbon, mostly because the town council couldn't think of anyone with a better claim to the honor, and because he cried the whole time in a way that made several attendees, myself included, need a tissue for reasons that had nothing to do with allergies. Marjorie's lasagna recipe, properly credited, exactly as promised, right there on a laminated placard by the dining room door, family recipe, secret ingredient, nutmeg, per R. Carter, sold out by 7 p.m., and the inn's new owner, a cheerful woman named Beth who had absolutely no idea what she'd purchased beyond charming fixer-upper, surprisingly good bones, Told me over cocktails that guests kept reporting the strangest, loveliest thing, that the house always seemed to know exactly what they needed. A cold glass of water left outside a door before anyone asked. A stuck window that opened itself on hot nights. A crossword puzzle, half finished, tucked helpfully into a nightstand drawer for insomniacs. It's probably just good staff, Beth said, sipping her wine, entirely unaware of exactly how good the staff situation at Thornfield Manor had once been, and, apparently, in some small, gentle way, still was. Honestly, the reviews have been incredible. Someone even left 5 stars just for ambience, indescribably cozy, 10 out of 10, would recommend. I raised my glass to that, quietly, to a governess who'd spent 30 years being terrible at scaring people and wonderful at everything else, and let Beth believe, for now, that it was just good staff. Alex's true crime channel, for what it's worth, did eventually cover the Thornfield Manor story, heavily fictionalized, at Constance's polite but firm request, delivered to him in a dream that he swore, absolutely swore, was real, involving a stern woman with a clipboard warning him that certain parties would be very cross if their actual names were used without proper written consent. The video's called "I Was Haunted by History's Most Passive-Aggressive Ghost," not clickbait, and it remains, to this day, his most successful upload, 400,000 views and counting, monetization achieved several times over, which I like to think Rachel would find both hilarious and a little bit validating, given everything. As for me, Bertha finally, fully retired 8 months later, replaced by a car with considerably fewer opinions, and I kept taking cases, mostly missing pets, the occasional cheating spouse, one memorable afternoon spent locating a stolen garden gnome that turned out to have simply been repositioned by a bored teenager 3 houses down. Nothing quite as strange as Thornfield Manor ever came my way again, which, honestly, I'd decided is for the best. A woman can only handle so many ghost book clubs in one lifetime, and I'd like to think I used up my supply responsibly, and with the appropriate amount of lasagna. And that's the story of how I fixed a haunted house's paperwork, gained a long-lost ghost relative, and walked away with a killer lasagna recipe. Thornfield Manor's a bed and breakfast now. 5 stars. Ask for the secret ingredient, the owner just winks. If you enjoyed this one, stick around, Ashford Hollow's full of weird cases, and apparently I'm the only detective foolish enough to take them. Until the next mystery, stay curious, stay caffeinated, and never, ever trust a house with a suspiciously clean dining table. This has been The House That Counted, very badly. See you in the next one.